We just saw how 1 Corinthians can be divided into two parts. In chapters 1 to 6, Paul responds to the report that Chloe brought to him about conditions in Corinth. And in chapters 7 to 16, Paul responds to specific questions that the Corinthian Christians have. So, first section is Chloe's report, and it says the first thing she has to report here on this list. It has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are divisions among you. Some follow Paul, some follow Apollos, some follow Peter. And it seems as if they're forming factions, they're being groupies of various church leaders. And Paul is going to start off by saying, man, thank goodness I didn't baptize any more people in Corinth than I did. It would give you even more of a reason to say, I'm part of the Paul Club. Well, what does it mean for someone to follow Apollos, say? I think that verse 17 is going to give us a bit of a clue. Let's take a look at that. All right, so I appeal that there be no divisions among, this word division is very important. Schisma kind of sounds like a schism. It's going to show up in several different instances throughout 1 Corinthians. So we'll keep an eye out for that. Now it says, it's been reported to me by Chloe's people that there's quarreling among you. You follow all these different leaders. And in verse 17, it says, now Christ didn't send me to baptize. And what he probably means by that is he didn't send me to collect people into my club. No, but he sent me to preach the gospel, but not with words of eloquent wisdom. What's my preaching like? My preaching, Paul says, is not eloquent or refined, sophisticated, impressive. That's the kind of preaching and speaking and wisdom that the Corinthians value. That's human wisdom. And it kind of makes sense based upon the location of Corinth. Now, you remember Corinth is just tucked there right next to Athens. And in Paul's second missionary journey, first he went to Athens, and then just a few miles away, he traveled to Corinth. And look at this little verse from Paul's account of his missionary experience in Athens. And it kind of gives you an idea of the Corinthians' idolization of human wisdom through the display of rhetoric in one's speaking. So here Paul is in Athens, and it says that all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there, they would spend their time in nothing except for telling or hearing something new. You see, the Athenians, and probably the Corinthians too, based upon Paul's emphasis in these chapters, especially 118 to 216, on human wisdom versus the wisdom of God. The Corinthians most likely idolized orators, those who have powerful and impressive rhetoric. And this is kind of ironic because here I have this fancy little microphone. I feel like a diva right now. So in the same way that people from our culture might idolize divas or pop singers or certainly movie stars, so people in that day in Corinth idolized those with great speaking ability. And they looked at Paul and his message and his speaking, which was not eloquent, and they would laugh at it, saying, you are not wise because you don't have a command over your tongue like some of our impressive speakers do. Well, unfortunately, those impressive speakers in Corinth and their neighbor Athens, they really cared about style over substance. It mattered to them more how you spoke than what you spoke. But that was not the case with Paul. He was all about substance. And what was the substance? What was the message of his preaching? The message was the cross. Don't you remember in 1 Corinthians 2, it says, for when I was among you, I determined to know nothing except for him and him crucified. And the cross was in those days not a popular message. I mean, among the Jews, it was a stumbling block. And you think, why was the cross a stumbling block for the Jews? Well, they were anticipating a victorious Messiah, not a dying Messiah. That made no sense to them. It was a stumbling block. And to the Greeks, the cross was folly. And their concern most likely was about the physicality of the whole thing. I mean, God taking on flesh in the incarnation, that makes no sense at all according to the Greeks. God is transcendent. He dwells in the realm of the forms. But matter is beneath him. Why would he assume matter? And certainly, why would he then go on to die? For God, he cannot feel anything. He can't feel pain. He certainly can't accept death. So the cross was folly to Gentiles. So what was God up to then with this message of the cross, which seems so countercultural to all of its audience? Well, let's take a look. God had a specific objective in mind with a message that seems so foolish. This is big. This is one of the tougher sections in 1 Corinthians for sure, but it's important and very powerful. Let's go back to, I'm in Acts. I'm like, where am I? 1 Corinthians 1:20. Now, Paul's going to ask with a lot of sarcasm, who is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? You think the debater, he certainly is very eloquent. He asks, where is the debater of this age? And look what God was doing with the message of the cross. Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom. Through worldly wisdom, they were not able to accept the message of the cross. Down to 27. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. There's a lot of wise or supposedly wise people in Corinth. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong, what is low and despised, even the things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are. What's the purpose of all of that? So that no human may boast before God. So what's Paul and God through Paul up to with this message of the cross? He's undermining the worldview which was probably unconsciously adopted by many Corinthians, saying that man's wisdom is not God's wisdom. So then who can accept this message of the cross if it's a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles? Well, it's the low, it's the weak, it's the despised, it's those who are not, that God will open their spiritual eyes to see the wisdom in the cross. Let's see that depicted here in the text again. Down in 2:14, it says that the natural person, the person who is wise with the wisdom of this world, they do not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him. They're not able to understand it because these things, the wisdom of God through the cross, is spiritually discerned, and God opens the eyes of those who are weak to accept those things. Now, next, Paul, so we just looked at 1:18 to 2:16, and next here in 3:4, Paul he's really going to jab them with this one, saying that because there are divisions among you, this proves that you are not spiritual. Now you remember the Corinthians, they think they're so wise, they think they're so spiritual, and Paul's just going to say, if there's divisions among you, this means you are not spiritual. And these verses 3:1 to 4 are really important, so let's take a look at them for understanding the whole idea of the book of 1 Corinthians. He's going to say, you know what, brothers? I love to address you as spiritual people, but I cannot address you as spiritual, but rather as people of the flesh. Why? Are you still of the flesh? For as long as there is jealousy and strife among you, one person saying, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, as long as there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh? For people of the flesh who are acting in a human way say, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos. That's merely human behavior. For spiritual people, the way that they act and behave, it results not in division, but in unity. See, their version of spirituality was boasting in men so as to one up themselves and say, well, so You silly person, you follow Peter. Well, of course you follow Peter. What a fool. I follow Apollos. Come on, Apollos people, let us go this way. That's the wisdom of the world that they're following. But the wisdom of God, following the message of the cross, breeds unity and love, not division. So, having addressed the way that they are regarding the apostles, now he's going to say, this is how you should address us, or should regard us, or should think about us as apostles and as servants of God. Now, first, he's going to say, we as apostles, we're slaves in God's field, in His building. You elevate us so high, but in fact, we are slaves. Now, take a look at this in 4:1. All right, this is how one should regard us. We are servants. We are slaves of Christ, and they are slaves, specifically, Paul's going to say, in God's field. Now, you remember that line in chapter 4 where it says that I planted, Paul, Apollos watered, but it was God who gave the growth. Therefore, God is the one who should get the glory. So do not boast in man. This makes no sense. But the second implication of this is if we're God's slaves, well, then God as our master, he is our judge, not you. So stop judging us. And I think he uses this word judge as his critique of their picking favorites, this kind of favoritism. I follow Apollos or Peter. What you're doing when you're joining these different camps or clubs is you're judging us, but really God is the one who is the judge, and he's going to make that point at several different points here in this section, 3:5 to 4:21, and let's look at one of them. Let's go to 4:3. It says that with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. I don't even judge myself. It is the Lord who judges me. So don't pronounce judgment before the time. God is the one who's going to judge. And at that time, each one will receive his commendation. Paul's going to receive a commendation. It's going to look like this. Apollos is going to receive a commendation. Peter's going to receive one. You see earlier, it shows the same thing. Paul and Apollos, they're going to receive these wages, and I'm going to receive a different wage. We'll receive different rewards, it says. But the main idea here is that God is the judge and not you. So, secondly, how else should the Corinthians regard the apostles? First off, they're slaves of God. Secondly, the apostles are last of all, Paul says. This is really powerful stuff. You see, these Corinthians, they want to idolize their favorite leader, put them up on a pedestal. But Paul is saying, don't you realize we apostles are not first? We apostles are last. Look at this in 4:9. We apostles are last. And this is interesting how he introduces this. He says, for, I think, I've kind of been thinking about this one for a while. Why am I suffering so much as an apostle? You know what? I've come to the conclusion. I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all. We are men sentenced to death, a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to men. We have become, and still are, like the scum of the world. We are the refuse of all things. I mean, the refuse? Like, are you really, Corinthians, going to put poo up on a pedestal? Because that's kind of what you're doing here. We are the last of all as the apostles. And then this section here, which I've called you, we are last, but you're going to make yourself first. This is, the Corinthians are guilty of what Jesus' disciples were guilty of. Remember when they were walking on the road and arguing with one another about who was going to be greatest? And Jesus came and said, no, the last will be first and the first will be last. Paul has to use that same argument with the Corinthians, and look in 4:8 for that argument. This is just dripping with sarcasm and irony. It says, You already have all you want, making yourself out to be first. You are rich. You've become kings. But we, as God's slaves, the apostles, we are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise. We are weak, but you are strong. You are held in honor, but we in disrepute. Paul is saying to them, like, check your pride, Corinthians. Stop thinking of yourself so highly. And these are heavy words. I mean, he's just slapping them on one cheek and then the next. And then he's going to say, look at this. He's going to say, I write these things not to make you ashamed, he says in verse 14. See this in this strong green color. I write these things not to make you ashamed, but to admonish you. And while he does say this several times throughout 1 Corinthians, Paul's goal, his objective, is to take the Corinthians down a couple notches. Remember, their main issue is kind of spiritual pride. And Paul, he intends to humble that pride. And let me show you how that works out in this next section, sexual immorality and lawsuits. So how is Paul taking them down a couple notches? Well, he's going to ask in chapter 5, you are arrogant. You, Corinthians, you have no reason to be arrogant. You have not got no reason to boast. And then down in chapter 6, when he addresses another issue, he says, I say these things to your shame. You should be ashamed that these things are happening in your church. 1534, same thing again. I say this to your shame. So what's one of the shameful things that Chloe is going to report here to Paul, and it's going to make Paul pull his hair out? Well, in chapter 5, Chloe's going to share an issue, just a horrible issue. There's someone in the church at Corinth who is sleeping with his father's wife. So it's not his biological mother. His father probably took another wife, and that guy is sleeping with his father's wife. I mean, this is awful. Even the Gentiles don't sink this low. And Paul is going to say, cleanse the leaven, get him out of the church. And this reminds him of a letter that he wrote, his first letter. Remember, this is Corinthians B. Well, Corinthians A, he said, do not associate with the sexually immoral. And then he uses this instance to kind of bring greater clarity to that initial letter. And he says, what I meant by that was do not associate with those who are outside the church, who are sexually immoral. If that was the case, well, then you'd never evangelize your neighbors because everyone in Corinth is sexually immoral. What I meant is do not associate with the sexually immoral who are inside the church, who claim to be believers and yet are acting in this way. Rather, God is going to judge those outside the church, but it is the responsibility of the church leadership to judge those inside the church. So that's one issue that Paul addresses here from Chloe's report. The next issue is lawsuits. So this is another instance of division. Remember, division is an important problem in Corinth. And if one Christian is suing another Christian in court, I'm sure there's a division happening there somewhere. And Paul is going to, this is, that instance here in chapter 6 where he says, you're arrogant? Why would you be arrogant if Christians in Corinth are suing one another? This is crazy, he says. And then he's really going to kind of jab them here in these verses. This is chapter 6, verse 1 to 8. He's going to say, is there no one wise enough in your congregation to settle this problem, to reconcile these brothers in the church? You who value wisdom so highly, is there no one wise enough that can handle this? And then he's going to use this expression, which is all throughout 1 Corinthians. He's going to say, do you not know? This shows up 10 times in 1 Corinthians. The next book that has the highest use of this phrase is Romans, and it's only there 4 times. And in any other book, it only shows up once. But here in 1 Corinthians, 10 times, do you not know? And Paul is appealing to the Corinthians' knowledge, where they are proud of their knowledge. And he says, you should really know this. And this concept is kind of alluded, and the ground is laid for it in the thanksgiving of 1 Corinthians in the opening verses. Let's look at that. All right, 1 Corinthians 1:1. Let's see this thanksgiving. I give thanks to my God always for you, because of the grace God gave you, enriching you in all speech. They're very proud of their eloquence, and in all knowledge. Do you not know? And then, of course, it says here, you're not lacking any spiritual gift, and spiritual gifts are going to be very important in chapters 12 to 14. So he appeals to their pride a little bit here by asking, do you not know that you, the Corinthians, in the eschaton, you will judge the angels? I mean, is that not amazing that glorified believers will have a authority over angels and command them in some sense? So if that's going to be true in the future, and you who have this mighty authority, you can't settle these disputes within the church? Come on, get with the program a little bit here. All right, last part in this report section, verses 6 to 20, or chapter 6, verse 9 to 20. We're going to return to this issue of sexual immorality, and it appears Chloe is going to share with Paul that there's a proverb that's going around the church in Corinth. Everyone's saying it. They're saying, all things are lawful for me. And with a lot of things, a lot of the issues in Corinth, there's a grain of truth to it, but it's been manipulated. So they probably have the idea of Christian freedom with this proverb. They are, as New Covenant believers, they are free from observing Old Covenant food laws. They are free to eat idol meat as well. But they've taken this idea of Christian freedom and they've mixed in that Greek philosophical dualism again. And they think, hey, you know what? If all things are lawful for me, I could go visit a prostitute. No big deal. The body's going to burn anyway, so why does it matter? Let me show you how they can make this just insane leap with their thinking. Let's take a look at 6:12 to understand this. Now, these sections in red are those proverbs, those things that the Corinthians are saying. They say, all things are lawful for me. But Paul corrects them by saying, yeah, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but I will not be dominated by anything. They say, the food is for the stomach. The stomach's for food. And you know what? God's going to destroy the stomach someday. So what does it matter what I eat? What does it matter if I sleep with a prostitute? And Paul is going to say, the body was not meant for sexual immorality. You see, what you do with the body matters, Paul says. And it matters, one, because God created the body, two, because God assumed a physical body in the incarnation with Jesus of Nazareth, and then three, do you not know your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? Your physical flesh, the Spirit indwells that space. And then, of course, God is going to recreate that body as well, but we'll get to that next when we address the questions that the Corinthians have for Paul.